Okay, so in this video I'm just going to go over variable types, public variables, custom events, timelines, and commenting. Um, so for this here, I've already created a blueprint, which is also going to be sitting in your project assets folder or content browser. If you wanted to make your own, again, all you have to do is right click, blueprint class, choose actor. Now, I've named mine's variable types. You can name yours whatever you want. But what I've done in mine when I open it up is not very much other than in the left hand side I've made 6 variable types, and they're all different. So we've got a boolean, integer, float, vector, string, transform, and a rotator. To make a variable, it's really simple. All you have to do is hit this plus button, name it, and here in the top right hand corner you can choose what variable type that you want to have. Now these here ones are probably the most or common ones that you'd find and use, but there's many more, and every class actually that you make in Unreal 4 can also be used as a variable, but that's something that we'll cover in a more advanced session. So I'm just going to delete this variable that I've created, and I'm just going to go through the different types that we have. So a boolean, okay, is a very simple variable where it's an on and off switch, basically true or false, and it's really good for comparing other variables and then doing one or two other things depending on what that variable is. So for instance, you could check if a player has a key, and you could name a variable, has key, and for most of the game, the player may not have a key, so it's set to false, but once they pick that key up, it's set to true, which may mean that they can open certain doors if you check that boolean. An integer is a whole number, which means it doesn't have any decimal places. So you can see over here, I wouldn't be able to put in 1.2, it would just switch it back to 1. So that's a whole number. A float is something that can have a decimal place. So this here is something that could have like 1.2 as its value. A vector, okay, default value is always set to 0, 0, 0, is just coordinates, okay, that you can use in game. So it's really good for maybe set an object's place. Okay, so maybe if you've got a spawn point, you can use the location that's set in this vector to spawn a player somewhere. A string is just a small text file that you can use. A transform is actually your location, rotation, and scale. Okay, and then rotator is just your rotator. With each one of these variables that we have, we can drag them out and let them go here, and we can get them or set them. Okay, and I'm going to go through what both of these mean. So I'll start off with the set. So basically, the set allows us with the boolean to set it to true or false. If this box isn't ticked, it's false, and if it is, it's true. So for instance, if we had event begin play on this, so remember this fires off as soon as you press play, we could set this boolean to false, and then if we were to call on that variable again, remember we've got it here, we could use that, but we would know from the beginning of the game it would be set to false. So I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll show that in an easy way. We'll put a delay on here of maybe 2 seconds. So what we're going to do is, because the default value for this boolean is false to start off with, we're going to put a delay on when you press play, and then it's going to set it to true. But we want to see that print out. Okay, so what we're going to do is right click, and we're going to type in print, and you'll find under string you've got this print string, and we're going to have this attached to our event tick, and again this is going to fire off every frame. So what I can do is, although these colors don't match up sometimes, which is really helpful in Unreal, they'll convert your variable for you. So if I place this here, you can see it's saying there it's going to convert the boolean to a string. Okay, so to start off with, for every frame up to 2 seconds, this should print off false. And then when we set this to true, it's going to be printing this off still. It should switch to true. So remember, press compile if you've changed anything. Save it. And I'm going to have to place this in my level, okay, for it to work. Press play. And what you'll see is when I do press play, up in the top left hand corner, you'll see this string of true or false coming down. So remember, it'll be false to start off with, and then after 2 seconds it should switch to true. There we go. And again, you can do this with a lot of other variables. So let me delete the boolean, and I'll get an integer, and I'll set it. So by default, this is going to be 1 to start off with. So what we'll do is, after 2 seconds, we're going to set it to 2. We're going to get it here, plug it in the string, and you can see it's going to convert that integer to a string for us. So it's going to print out to the screen this value of the integer. So if I press play, it'll be 1, and then after 2 seconds, it'll switch to 2. So that's the set and get of variables. So that's how you set a variable, and then that's how you use a variable. That's probably the least complicated way you could use a variable, but hopefully it'll give you a good idea. So another thing that you can do with these variables, we'll start off with the integer and float maybe, is if I drag one in and just get it, is you can do some arithmetic with them. So if I pull out this string or this node, again it's all very context sensitive, so Unreal 4 understands that I have an integer variable that I've pulled out. So if I hit the minus key, you can see that I can get an integer minus integer. So basically I can get whatever value I have in my integer, which by default is 1, and then minus 1 off that, so it would be 0. Or I can hit the plus key and get integer plus integer. I can also do, if I hit the star key, I can get a multiplication, and backslash will get you a division. Okay, so you've got quite a lot there to do. But what we can do here is we can go to our integer and maybe set it to 50. Actually, no, we'll go for 120. And what we want to do every frame is minus 1 off this 120. So if I get my integer, okay, and I set it, so I do, I can then grab my integer and get it. Okay, so this is 120 to start off with. And what I'll want to do is get the minus. So I'm going to minus by 1 and plug it into the set. So instead of it hard coding it, okay, as 0 or something like that, I'm going to do it this way and plug that in. So what's happening here, every frame, it's going to set the integer by getting the current value of the integer and taking 1 off it. Okay, and so if we get a print string from that, we can get our integer here as well and just plug it in. Or if you wanted to, you could just grab another one of it and plug it in there. So I'm going to print this out every frame as well. So if I press play now, you can see that it's taken 1 off every frame. And since this computer is running at a very, very high frame rate, it's not doing it every second or anything like that. It's probably 120 a second. So what we can do then is maybe add a delay in here of 1 second. I'll set my default value to 5. So set that duration there. And what we can do is we can add in a branch. Okay. And we can compare our integer to something. So if I grab my integer and I get it, and if I say, you know, is this less than So I can go, is this less than or equal to 0? And if that's true, I can get a print string and say true, or I can pull out from my false and get another print string and just say false. So what's happening here? So event tick, it's going to fire every frame, but it's going to get delayed by a second, okay? So it's just basically a countdown second. We're going to get our integer, which by default is set to 5. And what we're going to do is every second we're going to get the current integer value minus 1 from it, okay? And then we're going to compare that integer and see if it's less than or equal to 0. If it is less than or equal to 0, it's going to print off true. If it's not, okay, false, it's going to print off false. And this branch is really, really handy for comparing and branching off, you know, if or else statements basically. So if I compile and save that, we should see false to start off with, and then after 5 seconds, a true. There we go. So we could take this one step further by adding in a light component. So instead of these print strings, we can have our light turn off and on, basically depending on the number of this integer. So I'll delete these, and in the top left you've got your component section. So I'm going to add a component to this. I'm just going to search for light, and I'm going to put in a point light, and in my viewport you can see there's a point light. By default, okay, Unreal is going to give you this default scene rate, which is handy sometimes because it's kind of like the parent of everything. But if you don't want that there, just drag your point light onto it, okay, and it'll get rid of it, and that there will become the default scene rate as well as a component. So what we can do is with this light, we can get it, and if I pull out from that, just type in hidden like the last video. If this is true, it's going to set it to hidden, and if it's false, we're just going to leave it, okay? So there we go. You can see our blueprints in there now. It looks like a light. I'm going to delete the other lights just to make it easier. I'm going to press play. So after a few seconds that should turn off when that integer hits 0. And you can see what happened there. You know, it was the same thing. It was delayed by a second, and every time it hits this set, it's taken 1 off the actual value of integer, and then it's checking that value against 0, and if it is 0 or under, it's going to set this to true, which hides the light in the game. And we can change this a bit, okay, by getting our light, and we can set the intensity of it instead. So what I can do is I can either hard code in the intensity here, okay, or what I can do is I can grab a float and I can get that and I can plug that in. And I'll set the value of that to something like 200. So now instead of it being hidden in the game, it's actually going to set the intensity of the light from, I think its default is 5000, yeah. So there you can see the intensity for it is 5000. And it's going to set it, you know, down to 200. So if I compile, save that, press play. So it shouldn't turn off, it should just dim it quite a bit. There we go. Don't know if you can see in the video, but the light is still on. What would happen though if we had 2 of these blueprints in our scene, and we wanted these lights to be different values when they dim down? Well, there's a way to do that, okay, and it's quite simple. If I go to my float and you can see there's a closed eye icon here. If I click on that, it opens up the eye, and basically it makes it public. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, if I compile and save that, and if I select this light, you can see now under default it's got my float there, and I can set that to whatever I want for this particular blueprint in my level. So I can set this here one to something like 3000, and then I can set this here one to, I'll keep it at 200. So it means we're using the same blueprint class, okay, and there's two different blueprints in our level, but by making that variable public, I can have two different variable values that we can go off. So if I press play, after 2 seconds, one should brighten up and the other should dim. So using public variables is a really good way of having one blueprint class do many different things in a level. Next I want to talk about timelines, which are pretty useful when using blueprints as well. I'll start off simple. What we'll do is we'll delete what we have, okay, and we'll just go up to the event begin play, and we'll add in a delay of 2 seconds, just so whatever we're doing doesn't begin as soon as we press play. And we're going to create a timeline, okay, which is pretty simple. All you have to do is right click, type in timeline, and at the very bottom you'll find a timeline, okay, and I'm going to name it because in one blueprint you may have like a lot of these, so it's a really good idea to name them. So I'm going to just type in light underscore intensity. I put an underscore in there because Unreal 4 really doesn't like spaces, okay, so use underscores instead. And you'll probably notice that we've got a lot of nodes that we can use here. So we've got play, play from start, stop, reverse, reverse from end, a new time, update, finish, and then direction. Okay. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll tell you about a few of them in a bit. So this isn't all of our timeline. We can double click it, and you can see it opens up a new tab here at the top. I can close that again. So if I double click it, it opens up a new tab. I can go to my event graph, or I can go into that timeline. And there isn't very much here just because there are no timelines being created just yet. We've got a few options though for what we can do with them. We can have a float track, we can have a vector track, we can have an event track, and we can have a color track. So a float track will probably suit us best right now because our intensity value is a float value. If we were moving this blueprint or something like that there, we could use a vector track. Or if we were creating an event like a particle effect flying off at a certain time, we can use an event track. Or if we wanted to change the color of our light, we can use a color track. So I'm just going to click on this F, that's a float track. I'm just going to call this intensity. And the reason I do that, if I just hit compile and go back out to our event graph, you can see we've got an extra node now there called intensity. And here's our track, okay, from 0 to whatever, and 0 going upwards as well. We can zoom out by holding down or by scroll wheeling, and right click and holding down lets us pan in here as well. We've also got this few options up here, like the length of our track, 5 seconds long at the minute. Will it use the last keyframe as the length? Will it autoplay? Will it loop? Will it replicate? Or ignore time dilation, which is if you're going in the slow motion or something like that. What we want to do though is we want to add a few keyframes in here. Okay, so to do that, you hold down Control, you click. Oh, sorry, you hold down Shift and click. And I'm going to add in 2 keyframes. So what are these keyframes? Well, these are what are going to hold the value that we're going to spit out at certain times, okay? And they're both connected together, you can see by this line. So if I was to get this keyframe and set the time to 0 and the value to 0, that means if we were to plug that into our intensity, at that moment in time, our light's intensity would be at 0. And then you can see the intensity steadily increasing over time. So I'm going to grab this one, set it to 5, and the value I'm going to set to 3000. And you'll probably notice that my line is shot away off because really all I'm seeing here is 0 to 4, okay, in the value range. So to kind of see all that, if I click this zoom to fit button on both sides, you can see now it's gone from 0 to 3000, okay, and it's a lot easier to see. So that's our timeline at the minute. So basically what we want to do is when our delay is completed, we want to play from start. Okay, and then we're going to get our light again. We're going to pull out from that and get the intensity. We're going to set it. And there's a few nodes here, okay? So update, this here is going to fire off on every frame update, okay? So that's the one we kind of want to use. This here one only fires off when it gets to the end of that track, which is 5 seconds. So, you know, you could have like a print string or something there just to say finished or something like that if you wanted to. But you can see, look, we've got a new intensity for our light and the intensity here. So if we connect them up, basically every frame that this here timeline's running now, it's going to update the intensity with the value that we've got on our timeline track here. So a value between 0 and 3000 anywhere along this time. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to by default set our intensity for this light to 0 and compile and save that. So it's going to start off on 0 as well. So if I press play, after 2 seconds or so, you can see our light will start to come in. Oh, we've got 2 lights in here, I forgot. And after 5 seconds, they'll reach their peak intensity. So I could even come back in if I wanted to, get the value of that last one and set it to 7000. Save. Press play again. You can see the lights are coming on. Again, with the timeline, there are other tracks. There's a vector track. Okay, that works in X, Y, and Z coordinates that you can use in the 3D space. We've got a event track, okay, that we can add in. Basically, this event track, type in event. Every time that you have one of these keyframes, you can actually make it fire off an event, alright, which is really handy. So instead of it updating something, you could make it, you know, fire off a particle effect spawning where the light is, so there's, you know, like sparks coming off it. And then you've also got the color track. This here one again works the same way, keyframes. So I've got 2 keyframes here where I'll set the color to the first one to blue, make sure the opacity is up at 100, and the next one red, just set the opacity 100. So over 5 seconds my light, or I haven't set it up yet, but the light will be going from blue to red. So if I compile and save that, and I'm just going to delete my event track. So all I've got, oh, I forgot to name my color one. So I've got my color, I'll get my light again, type in color. I believe, yeah, it's using American English. So set light color, so update, and then we'll plug in this color. And by default, I'm just going to switch my light value back to 3000. Okay, so press play. After 2 seconds, they should turn to blue, and then change to red. So timelines are really handy to use. Again, like you use them for doors, elevators, anything that has like an animation in your game can use timelines really. So lastly, I just want to go over commenting and variable names. At the minute, we don't really have any comments. in our blueprint. And if you're working even in a small team, having comments is a really good way of communicating with other people working on the same level or scripting, anything like that, because it'll give them an idea of what you're thinking, what you're trying to achieve with this certain bit of scripting. Creating comments is really simple. You could do it two ways. So you can comment on a particular node if you want to. So see the way if I hover over this, it gives me a small dialog box here. It means like I can add a comment in here, such as light color. But really, that's probably not the best way of doing it. The best way of doing it is if you grab whatever nodes you have that are doing a certain function. So these three nodes here are, changing the color of my light. So if I've got them selected and press C, I can create a comment that encapsulates those three nodes. And I can say light color change on timeline. I can also select that comment and change the color of it. Let's change it to red. And the cool thing about this is if I zoom out, it will kind of expand that text box as well, so that it's very easy to see. And if I drag around this text box, anything that was commented in there follows it. So rearranging your scripting and making it neat and tidy, which everybody should be doing, it's a lot easier to do that. In terms of variable names, you should always make it pretty obvious what that variable is trying to do in the least number of words possible or letters possible. So for instance, that float that I was using before was the intensity for the light. Usually I would never use it float, but I would type in light intensity. And that means it's just going to be a lot easier for people to recognize what that variable is doing. And you can see that it's using, it's actually put a space in there where I've got two capital letters. So that's pretty handy. So you don't have to have any spaces in your variable when you're naming it. But if each word begins with a capital letter, Unreal will instinctively know to put a space in or before that. So it's really handy too.